My mother-in-law wore white to my wedding, so I announced her arrest warrant during my vows. My mother-in-law Brianna arrived at my wedding in a full white ball gown with a cathedral train longer than mine. She walked down the aisle before me, throwing rose petals, wearing a veil, waving at guests like she was the bride. My husband James stood frozen at the altar, his face crimson as she took her seat in the front row, adjusting her train to spread across the entire space. This was her final move in a 6-month campaign to destroy our wedding. She'd called our venue pretending to be me and canceled our booking. Told the caterer we wanted to change everything to foods I'm allergic to. Sent corrected invitations with wrong dates to half our guests. But James insisted she was just struggling with him getting married. Standing at the altar, looking at her smirking in white, I knew this would never stop unless I ended it now. 3 weeks earlier, Detective Jason had contacted me. Brianna had been using my identity for 2 years, opening credit cards, taking loans, filing tax returns in my name. They'd built their case and planned to arrest her after our honeymoon to avoid disrupting the wedding. But seeing her in that dress, I decided disruption was exactly what we needed. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, Brianna actually started to stand. That's when I raised my hand. Actually, I have something to say. The crowd murmured. James looked panicked. Brianna, would you please stand? She stood, smiling triumphantly. You look beautiful in white. Is that what you're planning to wear to your arraignment? Her smile froze. What? Detective Jason, are you here? A man in the third row stood. I'd invited him as a +1. Brianna Henderson, you're under arrest for identity theft, wire fraud, and tax evasion. The room exploded. Brianna tried to run, but her ridiculous train caught on chairs. She thrashed around screaming that I was setting her up while the detective cuffed her. James, tell them, she shrieked. Tell them she's lying. James stood frozen. Mom, what did you do? I did it for you. She's not good enough. I was protecting you. As the detective let her out, I turned to the crowd. There's more. Brianna used the stolen money to hire someone to seduce me. She wanted me to cheat so James would leave me. I played a recording from my phone. Brianna's voice filled the venue. Get her drunk. Get her to your apartment. All you need is one compromising photo. James went pale. His father stood up. I want a divorce, Robert announced. Then he looked at me. I'm sorry I didn't protect you from her. Also, Brianna's been embezzling from my company. That's why Detective Jason is really here. The wedding guests gasped. Then James's Aunt Helen stood. I helped her, Helen confessed, with the identity theft. Brianna promised me half. Another detective I'd invited stood up. Helen Jason, we need to talk. My maid of honor grabbed the microphone. Anyone else have crimes to confess? Because apparently this is what we're doing now. James's cousin stood. Brianna's been blackmailing me for 5 years. She has photos from when I was a stripper. Makes me pay monthly or she'll send them to my husband's boss. 3 more relatives stood with their own Brianna crime stories. Embezzlement, blackmail, fraud. She'd been running a crime ring using family as accomplices and victims. You knew? James asked me quietly. For 3 weeks. Why didn't you tell me? I tried. You said I was being dramatic. James looked around at his family being arrested, then back at me. My entire family is going to prison. Not all of them. Your dad seems nice. He laughed. Actually laughed. Still want to marry me? There's one more thing. I took a deep breath. I'm pregnant. 8 weeks. Your mother knew. She found the test when she broke into our apartment. That's why she escalated. The room went silent. She broke into our... James stopped, shook his head. Of course she did. Then he took my hands. I don't care if my family's going to prison. I love you. We're having a baby. Can we please get married before someone else gets arrested? Wait! Brianna's voice came through the detective's phone. She'd called from the police car. Check James's birth certificate. Check the date. 8 months after my wedding, not 9. Robert went rigid. Brianna, don't. He's not your son, Robert. You're sterile. You've always been sterile. Everyone turned to stare at James and Robert. I faked the fertility treatments. Brianna continued through the phone. Used a sperm donor. Donor number 447 from Portland Cryobank. James, your real father is some medical student who needed beer money in 1997. Robert collapsed into a chair. James stood frozen. I saved the receipts, Brianna screamed. Check my safe. The combination is your fake birthday, Robert. The detective muted his phone. We'll need to process that as evidence. I looked at my fiancé, who'd just learned his entire parentage was a lie. His mother was a criminal, his father wasn't his father, and he was about to be a dad himself. So, I said, want to skip the reception? James pulled me close. Vegas? Vegas. We walked out together, leaving the chaos behind. As we reached the door, the officiant called out, Wait, you're not officially married. James and I looked at each other, then at the disaster of our wedding. Perfect, we said in unison, and kept walking. We grabbed our bags and ran to the airport without telling anyone where we were going. The flight to Vegas was mostly quiet because neither of us knew what to say after everything that just happened. James kept staring out the window while I kept checking my phone to see all the messages piling up from people at the wedding. By the time we landed, it was almost midnight and we were both exhausted but also kind of wired from all the chaos. We took a cab to the first chapel we saw that was still open. The place had this huge neon sign shaped like Elvis that kept flickering on and off. Inside smelled like cheap perfume, and there was this guy dressed as Elvis who looked maybe 60 years old with a terrible wig. He took one look at my wrinkled wedding dress and James's crooked tie and said he'd seen weirder. I started laughing then, like really laughing, because here we were in this ridiculous chapel after the most insane wedding disaster in history, and it somehow felt more real than the fancy venue we'd spent months planning. The Elvis guy handed us these cocktail napkins and told us to write our vows. James wrote his first and passed it to me. His handwriting was messy, and it just said he promised to face whatever came next with me, and to never let his family's mess destroy what we had. I wrote mine saying I promised to be honest even when it was hard, and to build something better than what either of us came from. We stood there holding hands while Elvis read some standard ceremony stuff from a laminated card. When he got to the part about objections, I actually flinched, but nobody was there to object this time. We said our I do's and Elvis pronounced us married and played a recording of Can't Help Falling in Love on this old stereo. James kissed me, and I felt him shaking a little. We signed the marriage certificate with Elvis and some random woman who worked at the front desk as witnesses. The whole thing took maybe 15 minutes. Walking out of that chapel as actual married people felt surreal after everything that happened at the venue. The hotel room was basic but clean with this view of the strip that was all bright lights and noise. We both collapsed on the bed still wearing our wedding clothes and passed out immediately. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was already high and my phone was buzzing like crazy on the nightstand. I grabbed it and saw 73 missed calls. There were over 200 text messages from people we knew and people we barely knew, and even some numbers I didn't recognize at all. James woke up when he heard me scrolling through everything. His phone was going off too with the same kind of chaos. There were messages from his cousins and aunts and uncles and random friends from college. Some people were asking if we were okay, and others were demanding to know what really happened. A few reporters had somehow gotten my number and wanted interviews. James looked at all the notifications and then just turned his phone completely off. He said we should stay in Vegas for a few more days and hide from everything waiting back home. I agreed right away because the idea of going back and dealing with all those people and questions and the legal mess felt impossible. We ordered room service for breakfast and ate it in bed while watching bad TV. Neither of us talked about Brianna or the arrests or any of it. We just existed in this weird bubble where we were married and alone and didn't have to face reality yet. Later, we walked down the strip and gambled a little and saw a show with acrobats. James held my hand the whole time and I could feel him relaxing bit by bit. That night, we had dinner at this steakhouse and James actually smiled for real when the waiter brought out this huge dessert with sparklers. It felt like we were on an actual honeymoon instead of hiding from a disaster. But I knew we couldn't stay in Vegas forever, and eventually we'd have to go home and deal with everything we left behind. On the second day, my phone rang from a number James didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Elizabeth, and she was crying. She said she'd been so worried about us and nobody knew where we went. She sounded relieved when I told her we were okay and in Vegas. Then she started telling me what happened after we left the venue. Apparently, the whole place descended into total chaos, with guests splitting into groups and arguing about everything. Some people were saying I was a hero for exposing Brianna and standing up for myself. Others were calling me vindictive and cruel for doing it so publicly at my own wedding. A few of James's relatives were threatening to sue me for emotional distress or defamation or something. Elizabeth said she spent 2 hours trying to calm people down, but eventually everyone just left angry and confused. The venue staff had to call security because some guests were yelling at each other in the parking lot. She asked when we were coming home, and I told her honestly that I didn't know yet. She said she understood, and that she'd keep people away from our apartment as much as she could. After we hung up, James asked what she said. I gave him the summary and watched his face get tight when I mentioned his relatives threatening to sue. He said his family always picked Brianna's side no matter what she did. I reminded him that Robert didn't, and that mattered. James nodded, but I could tell he was thinking about all the relationships that were probably destroyed forever because of what happened. The third day in Vegas started quiet with us sleeping late and ordering breakfast again. We were sitting by the hotel pool when James's phone rang. He turned it back on to check messages, and immediately Robert's name popped up. James stared at the screen for a long time before answering. I watched his face while he talked, and it went through about 10 different emotions in 4 minutes. The conversation was clearly awkward and painful from what I could hear. James mostly said, "Yeah," and "okay," and "I understand." When he hung up, he was shaking. He told me Robert said he needed time to process everything, but didn't want to lose James from his life. Robert said the paternity thing was a shock, and he felt betrayed by Brianna. But James was still his son in all the ways that mattered. But then Robert also said he needed space to figure out his feelings and what their relationship would look like going forward. James said it felt like Robert was making their whole father-son relationship conditional on how fast he could get over being lied to for 30 years. I pulled James close and he started crying right there by the pool. He kept saying he didn't know who he was anymore if Robert wasn't really his dad. I held him and let him cry and didn't try to fix it because there was nothing I could say that would make this better. Some older couple at the pool kept staring at us, but I didn't care. After a while, James stopped crying and we just sat there holding each other. He said he wanted to go home even though he was scared of what was waiting. I said we'd face it together just like we promised in our cocktail napkin vows. We flew back 5 days after the wedding disaster happened. The flight home felt heavier than the one to Vegas, even though nothing had changed physically. When our cab pulled up to our apartment building, I saw the news vans right away. There were 3 of them parked on the street with reporters and camera people standing around drinking coffee. James went pale when he saw them. Apparently someone had leaked the whole story to the local media, and now they wanted interviews about the wedding day takedown and Brianna's crimes. One reporter spotted us getting out of the cab and started running over with her cameraman. James grabbed our bags and we basically ran for the back entrance of the building. Our neighbor who lives on the first floor saw us struggling and opened the back door to let us in quick. We thanked him and rushed upstairs to our apartment. Inside felt safe, but also like a trap, because we knew those reporters weren't going anywhere. I peeked out the window and saw them still waiting on the street. James slumped on the couch and said this was going to be our life now. I sat next to him and said it would die down eventually once they found a bigger story. But honestly, I wasn't sure if that was true. The whole thing felt like it was getting bigger instead of smaller. My phone buzzed with another message from a reporter asking for comment. I blocked the number and added it to the growing list. 2 days after we got home, Detective Jason called my phone. He said he needed me to come to the police station to give a formal statement about Brianna's identity theft. He wanted to go through the whole timeline of when I found out and what I did with that information. I went down to the station that afternoon and spent 3 hours in this small interview room going through every detail. The detective had me walk through how I first discovered the fake credit cards and the tax returns filed in my name. I explained about the loans Brianna took out using my social security number and how much debt she'd racked up. Then he asked about when I found out and why I waited 3 weeks to have her arrested. I told him about trying to tell James and him not believing me. I explained my decision to coordinate the arrest at the wedding so it would be public and undeniable. The detective wrote everything down and recorded it too. Then he asked about Brianna breaking into our apartment. I told him about coming home and finding things moved around, and then discovering my positive pregnancy test was missing from the bathroom trash. The detective's eyebrows went up at that. He said the break-in added another charge to Brianna's already long list. He asked if I had any proof she'd been in our apartment, and I remembered our building had security cameras in the hallways. He made a note to get that footage. By the time we finished, I was exhausted from reliving everything. The detective thanked me and said the prosecutor would be in touch soon about the trial timeline. Walking out of the police station felt weird, like I was the one who'd done something wrong even though I was the victim. James went to see a therapist that Elizabeth recommended the next week. She'd found someone who worked with family trauma and identity issues. James was nervous about it but agreed to try. He came home from the first session looking completely drained. I made him dinner while he sat at the kitchen table just staring at nothing. Finally, he started talking about what happened in the session. He said the therapist asked him to talk about his childhood and his relationship with Brianna. James said it was harder than he expected, because he had to untangle 30 years of what he thought was normal from what was actually manipulation. He talked about how Brianna always made him feel guilty for wanting independence, how she'd cry and say he was abandoning her whenever he tried to make his own choices, how she'd turn his relatives against anyone she saw as a threat. The therapist apparently said these were classic narcissist control tactics. James said hearing that made him feel stupid for not seeing it sooner. I told him he wasn't stupid, and that kids don't know their parents are manipulating them because that's all they know. He said the therapist wanted him to come back twice a week for a while. I said I'd support whatever he needed. That night, James couldn't sleep, and I found him at 2 in the morning looking at old family photos on his laptop. He was searching every face for signs he'd missed. A few days later, we got a call from someone named Augustine Mills who said he was Robert's divorce attorney. He asked if James would be willing to provide a statement about Brianna's behavior during his childhood. The lawyer said it would help Robert's case and make sure he got a fair settlement after decades of being deceived. James listened to the request and then said he needed time to think about it. After he hung up, he spent 2 whole days barely talking. I could tell he was torn up about the decision. On one hand, Brianna was his mother, and testifying against her felt like a betrayal. On the other hand, everything she did was wrong, and Robert deserved justice too. I didn't push him either way because it had to be his choice. Finally, on the second night, James said he'd do it. He called the lawyer back and agreed to give a statement. He said he couldn't protect Brianna anymore just because she was his mother. He said Robert had been a good father for 30 years and deserved the truth to be told. The lawyer scheduled a meeting for the following week. James seemed relieved after making the decision, but also sad, like he'd crossed some line he couldn't uncross. I had my first prenatal appointment the next Tuesday with a doctor named Leanna Curry that Elizabeth had recommended. The office was nice and calm, which felt good after all the chaos. Leanna was maybe 50 with kind eyes and this warm smile. She asked me basic questions about my health history, and then asked gently about my stress levels. I tried to say I was fine, but then I just started crying right there in her office. Everything came pouring out about Brianna and the arrests and James's identity crisis and the media circus. Leanna handed me tissues and waited until I calmed down. Then she said she was going to be honest with me about something. She said stress at my level was dangerous for the baby and I needed to find ways to reduce it, or there could be complications. She did an ultrasound and showed me the baby on the screen. She said I was 10 weeks along now and everything looked healthy, but I needed to take care of myself. Seeing the little blob on the screen made everything feel more real and more scary. I admitted to her that I was terrified of becoming a mother while dealing with this family implosion. She said those feelings were valid and normal. She gave me some resources for prenatal counseling and made me promise to come back in 2 weeks. Walking out of her office, I felt overwhelmed, but also somehow relieved that someone medical was watching out for me and the baby. That same week, Helen called James from jail. She was using her one phone call and she was crying and begging him to help her. She wanted James to convince me to drop the charges or at least speak on her behalf to the prosecutor. She kept saying she was sorry, and that Brianna had manipulated her too. James listened for a minute and then his face got hard. He told Helen he couldn't help her. He said she made her choices when she helped Brianna steal from me, and now she had to face the results of those choices. Helen started screaming at him through the phone. She said the family would never forgive us for destroying everyone's lives. She said we were selfish and vindictive and that we'd regret this. James told her she was the one who should have regrets. And then he hung up. His hands were shaking after the call ended. I asked if he was okay, and he said no, but he would be. He said he was done being manipulated by people who claimed to love him, but only wanted to use him. That night we ordered pizza and watched a movie and tried to pretend we were just a normal couple expecting their first baby. But we both knew normal was something we might never get back. 2 days after we got back from Vegas, a thick envelope showed up in our mailbox. I pulled it out and saw a law firm's return address, some fancy office in the financial district with multiple partner names. Inside was a letter on expensive paper, the kind that feels heavy and important. Brianna's lawyer wanted to meet with us about a potential plea deal. He wrote that his client was willing to accept responsibility for some charges if we would be willing to show leniency in our victim impact statements. The letter said Brianna could avoid the longest prison sentence with our cooperation, that the prosecutor would take our wishes into account. I read it twice, feeling my stomach turn over. James came home from his therapy appointment and found me sitting at the kitchen table staring at the letter. He picked it up and read it slowly, his lips moving slightly with the words. Then he read it again, then a third time. His face stayed completely blank, that careful, neutral expression he'd been wearing a lot lately. He set the letter down and looked at me with red eyes. What do you want to do? I didn't have an answer. Part of me wanted Brianna locked up forever for what she'd done to us, but another part of me knew James was already torn up enough without me pushing for maximum punishment against his mother. We sat there in silence for probably 10 minutes, just looking at the letter between us on the table. Saturday morning, I woke up to someone knocking hard on our apartment door. James was still asleep next to me, and I checked my phone to see it was barely 8 in the morning. I pulled on a robe and went to the door, looking through the peephole. Robert stood in the hallway holding 2 coffee cups from the shop downstairs. He looked terrible. His hair was messy, his eyes had dark circles under them, and his shirt was wrinkled like he'd slept in it. I opened the door, and he gave me this apologetic smile. I'm sorry for showing up like this. I should have called first. James heard voices and came out of the bedroom in his pajama pants, squinting at the light. Robert held up the coffee cups like a peace offering. We all ended up at our kitchen table, the 3 of us drinking coffee in this uncomfortable silence that felt thick enough to touch. Robert kept opening his mouth like he wanted to say something, then closing it again. James stared at his coffee cup. I felt like I should leave them alone, but also didn't want to abandon James if this went badly. Finally, Robert cleared his throat. I've been thinking about your first steps. You were 10 months old and you pulled yourself up using the coffee table. Brianna screamed for me to come watch and I ran in from the other room with the video camera. You took 3 steps toward me and then fell on your butt and laughed. James's eyes got wet, but he didn't say anything. Your first word was ball. Not mama or dada, just ball. You were obsessed with this red rubber ball and you'd point at it and yell ball over and over until someone threw it for you. Robert's voice cracked a little. First day of school you cried and held onto my leg and I had to pry your fingers off so the teacher could take you to your classroom. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes afterward because I was crying too. James started crying for real now, tears running down his face. Robert was crying too, wiping his eyes with his hand. None of those memories feel less real now. Not a single one. You're my son. I chose you every single day and I'd choose you again. James stood up so fast his chair scraped loud against the floor. Robert stood up too and they just grabbed each other in this tight hug, both of them shaking and crying. I got up and went to the bedroom to give them privacy, closing the door and sitting on the bed listening to them talk in low voices for the next hour. Elizabeth came over the following Tuesday to help me deal with the wedding gifts. Despite everything that happened at the ceremony, people had shipped us presents. Boxes kept arriving with registry cards and congratulations notes like nothing weird had happened at all. We sat on the living room floor surrounded by packages, and Elizabeth started opening them while I wrote thank you notes. She pulled out a set of matching towels with our initials embroidered on them, and we both just started laughing. It was this dark, slightly hysterical laughter because my mother-in-law was sitting in jail, and here we were opening towel sets. "This is so messed up," Elizabeth said, holding up a blender. "People sent us kitchen appliances while watching multiple arrests happen at our wedding. We kept opening boxes. Serving dishes, picture frames, a fancy coffee maker, sheet sets. Normal wedding gifts for the least normal wedding in history." Elizabeth got quiet after a while and then asked if I regretted how I handled everything. I thought about it while folding tissue paper. I don't regret exposing Brianna. She was destroying our lives and she wasn't going to stop. But I didn't fully think through what it would do to James. I knew it would be hard for him, but I didn't really understand how completely it would wreck his sense of who he is. Elizabeth nodded and kept unpacking boxes. Sometimes there are no good choices, only necessary ones. That felt true in a way that made my chest hurt. The prosecutor's office called and asked me to come in for a meeting. The prosecutor assigned to Brianna's case turned out to be this sharp woman named Rosamond. She had short gray hair and these intense eyes that made me feel like she could see right through any lie. We sat in her office and she laid out folders full of evidence on her desk. Bank statements, credit applications, tax returns, all with my information but Brianna's handwriting. Rosamond explained that Brianna's crimes were big enough that even with a plea deal she was looking at real prison time. Years, not months. She asked if I was prepared for what a trial would mean. Media attention, reporters following us around, my name and story all over the news. She asked specifically about my pregnancy and whether I understood the impact stress could have. I sat there realizing I hadn't really thought through the next 6 months. I was 11 weeks pregnant and Brianna's trial could go on for months. Cameras in the courtroom, my face on television, strangers on the internet picking apart every detail of our lives. Rosamond watched me process this and her expression got a little softer. "You don't have to decide anything today, but you need to think about whether you can handle a long public trial while you're pregnant. Some victims choose to let the prosecution handle everything without their direct involvement." I left her office feeling overwhelmed and scared in a new way. James's cousin Viola sent me a message asking if we could meet for coffee. I almost said no because I was tired of dealing with his family, but something about her message felt genuine. We met at a cafe near my office and she looked nervous, stirring her coffee over and over without drinking it. She apologized for not standing up to Brianna sooner. She explained that Brianna had been blackmailing her for 5 years, ever since Brianna found out about her past as a stripper. Monthly payments or Brianna would send the photos to her husband's boss, to their church, to their kids' school. Viola started crying right there in the cafe, talking about how trapped and ashamed she'd felt. She said my public exposure of Brianna at the wedding had freed her from years of manipulation. Other family members were coming forward now too, people who'd been too scared to report Brianna before. Viola grabbed my hand across the table. "Thank you. I know that sounds weird after everything, but thank you." I drove home thinking about how my decision to expose Brianna had consequences I never planned for. Some good, some terrible, all of them rippling out in ways I couldn't control. Rosamond Dean called 3 days later while I was making dinner. I answered on speaker, and her voice filled our kitchen with news I wasn't ready to hear. Brianna had rejected the plea offer. She wanted a trial. She was claiming she'd done everything to protect James from me, that I was the real criminal who'd manipulated everyone. Rosamond explained what trial meant. Months of court dates, media cameras outside the courthouse, reporters following us to work, to the grocery store, showing up at our apartment. James would probably have to testify against his mother, take the stand and answer questions about his childhood while Brianna sat there watching. I looked at James and watched the color drain from his face. His hand gripped the counter so hard his knuckles went white. Rosamond kept talking about jury selection and witness lists and discovery motions, but I could barely focus because James looked like he might throw up. She finished explaining the timeline and asked if we had questions. James cleared his throat twice before managing to speak. He said he'd do whatever was needed to hold Brianna accountable. His voice shook, but he got the words out. After we hung up, he went to the bathroom and I heard him getting sick. I stood outside the door feeling helpless and angry that Brianna could still hurt him from jail. Robert showed up that evening with a manila folder under his arm. He looked older than he had at the wedding, like the past 2 weeks had aged him years. James let him in and they sat at our kitchen table while I made coffee nobody wanted. Robert opened the folder and spread papers across the table. Divorce filing, restraining order application, financial disclosure forms. He explained he needed legal protection from someone who'd deceived him for 30 years. James picked up the restraining order request and read through it slowly. Brianna was prohibited from contacting Robert, coming within 500 feet of him, accessing any joint accounts or property. The reasons listed were fraud, financial abuse, identity theft, emotional manipulation. Robert pointed to another document, the divorce petition itself. It detailed Brianna's lies starting from before their wedding, the faked fertility treatments, the hidden cryobank receipts, the embezzlement from his company that she'd disguised as business expenses for 15 years. James read every page while Robert sat there waiting. I watched James's face as he saw his childhood reframed as evidence in a legal case. The family vacations Brianna had paid for with stolen money, the private school tuition she'd funded through fraud, birthday parties and Christmas presents bought with Robert's embezzled funds. When James finished reading, he stacked the papers neatly and pushed them back across the table. He told Robert he understood. Robert asked if James was okay, and James laughed, a bitter sound that hurt to hear. He said he didn't know what okay meant anymore. I called my parents the next morning and asked them to come over. They arrived within an hour, my mother carrying a casserole and my father looking worried. We sat in the living room and I explained what I needed. They couldn't bash Brianna in front of James. I knew they were angry. I knew they wanted to defend me. But James was processing too much already. My mother set down her coffee cup hard enough that it rattled. She said Brianna had tried to destroy me, had stolen my identity, had hired someone to seduce me. How was she supposed to pretend that was okay? I told her she didn't have to pretend anything was okay. I just needed her to focus on supporting us instead of attacking James's family. My father asked quietly if we were safe. The question caught me off guard. I realized I hadn't fully considered whether Brianna might retaliate from jail. She'd already smuggled out one phone call during her arrest. What else could she do? My mother saw my face and grabbed my hand. She said they'd do whatever I needed. She'd bite her tongue about Brianna. She'd focus on the baby and our future. But she made me promise to call the detective and ask about safety precautions. After they left, I sat there thinking about all the ways Brianna could still reach us even from behind bars. The letter arrived in our mailbox 4 days later. Plain white envelope, no return address, James's name written in handwriting I didn't recognize. He opened it at the kitchen table while I was doing dishes. I heard him suck in a breath and turned to see him staring at the page. Brianna's handwriting covered both sides in tight, angry script. Another inmate must have mailed it for her. James read it once, his face getting paler with each line. Then he stood up and carried it to the sink. He turned on the burner and held the letter over the flame until it caught. We watched it burn, black ash curling and falling into the sink. The smoke alarm started beeping and I opened a window while James ran water over the remains. He said he was done being manipulated by her words. She'd written that she'd done everything out of love, that I'd poisoned his mind against her, that he'd regret choosing me over his mother. The same guilt trips she'd used his whole life, just written down instead of spoken. I asked if he wanted to talk about it. He shook his head and said talking about it gave her power. He'd read it once, burned it, and now it was gone. But his hands shook while he scrubbed the ash from the sink. At 14 weeks pregnant, I woke up at 3 a.m. with cramping. I lay there for a minute trying to convince myself it was normal, just my body adjusting. Then I felt wetness and turned on the light to see blood on the sheets. I shook James awake and his eyes went wide when he saw. We dressed in 30 seconds and drove to the hospital with him gripping the steering wheel so hard I thought it might break. The emergency room was bright and cold and empty at that hour. A nurse took my vitals and got me into a room while James paced outside. Leanna showed up 20 minutes later in jeans and a sweatshirt, her hair in a messy bun. She'd been asleep when the hospital called but came immediately. She set up the ultrasound machine and squeezed gel on my stomach. The screen flickered to life and I held my breath waiting to see if our baby was still alive. The heartbeat appeared, strong and steady, and I started crying from relief. Leanna moved the wand around, checking everything while James stood frozen by the door. She said the baby looked fine, perfect size for 14 weeks, heartbeat normal. But my blood pressure was dangerously high. My stress levels were affecting my body in ways that could hurt the pregnancy. She suggested gently that I consider taking leave from work. Maybe limit my involvement in Brianna's legal case. Focus on staying calm and healthy for the baby. I nodded, but inside I was thinking about how impossible that seemed with a trial coming. Elizabeth showed up at our apartment 2 days later with a plan. She'd called our closest friends and organized what she called an intervention, but felt more like a rescue mission. 7 people crowded into our living room with notebooks and calendars. Elizabeth stood up and announced they were taking over. We weren't going to the grocery store anymore. Someone else would shop. We weren't cooking. They had a meal rotation schedule. We weren't running errands or dealing with media or handling anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. They'd created a system to shield us from the chaos. My coworker volunteered to pick up anything I needed from the office. James's friend from college said he'd handle our mail and screen it for anything from Brianna. Elizabeth's girlfriend offered to be our media liaison, dealing with any reporters who showed up. They passed around a shared calendar showing who was responsible for what on which days. I sat there feeling overwhelmed and grateful and guilty that they were doing so much. Elizabeth sat down next to me and said we'd been handling everything alone for a month. She'd watched us get thinner and quieter and more stressed. This wasn't charity, it was what friends did. I looked around at these people who'd rearranged their lives to help us, and realized how isolated we'd become trying to manage everything ourselves. James brought up finding his biological father a week later while we were folding laundry. He said he didn't want to replace Robert, but he needed to understand his genetic history for the baby's sake. What medical conditions ran in his biological family? Were there genetic risks we should know about? He'd been researching donor sibling registries and found one that connected people conceived through sperm donation. I watched him pull up the website on his laptop and start filling out the registration form. Donor number 447, Portland Cryobank. Estimated conception date. It was clinical and strange, reducing his paternity to data fields and checkbox options. He drafted a letter to the cryobank requesting any available information about his donor. Medical history, education, physical characteristics, anything they were legally allowed to share. He read the letter out loud 3 times, changing words, trying to sound professional instead of desperate. I sat next to him feeling the weight of what he was doing. Looking for a biological father while trying to repair his relationship with the man who raised him. Trying to understand his genetics while preparing to become a father himself. He sealed the letter in an envelope and set it on the counter to mail tomorrow. Then he closed his laptop and said he felt weird about the whole thing, but knew it was necessary. Robert started meeting James for breakfast every Saturday. The first time was awkward, both of them ordering coffee and eggs and barely talking. But the second week was easier. Robert told James stories about choosing to be his father every single day. How when James was 2 and threw tantrums in the grocery store, Robert chose to stay patient. When James was 7 and broke Robert's favorite watch, Robert chose to forgive him. When James was 16 and wrecked the car, Robert chose to hug him instead of yelling. Every moment of fatherhood had been a conscious decision to love James regardless of biology. James came home from these breakfasts quieter but calmer. He told me Robert's stories were helping him understand that family wasn't just DNA. It was action and choice and commitment. That Brianna's deception didn't erase 30 years of Robert choosing to be his dad. I watched James process this revelation slowly, seeing him separate biology from love in his mind. He said the breakfasts were becoming the best part of his week. Rosamond called to schedule my deposition, and I spent 2 days in a conference room answering questions. Brianna's defense attorney was a sharp woman in an expensive suit who made every question sound like an accusation. She asked about the timeline of when I learned about the identity theft, why I waited 3 weeks to expose Brianna, why I chose to do it at the wedding instead of privately. She suggested I'd orchestrated the public humiliation out of spite, that I was vindictive and calculating, that I'd enjoyed destroying Brianna in front of everyone. Rosamond objected repeatedly, her voice cutting through the attorney's insinuations. She redirected questions back to Brianna's actual crimes instead of my response to them, but the defense attorney kept pushing, trying to paint me as the villain in this story. She asked if I'd considered how my actions would affect James, if I'd thought about the media attention, if I'd planned the dramatic reveal to maximize Brianna's embarrassment. I answered every question as calmly as I could, but my hands clenched under the table. By the end of the second day, my jaw ached from grinding my teeth. Rosamond walked me out and said I'd done well, that the defense was grasping for anything to make Brianna sympathetic. But I drove home feeling drained and angry that I had to defend myself for exposing a criminal. At 16 weeks pregnant, we went for an ultrasound that would tell us the baby's sex. Leanna squeezed gel on my stomach and moved the wand around while James held my hand. The baby appeared on screen, bigger now, more human-shaped. Leanna pointed out the head and spine and tiny fingers. Then she angled the wand and smiled. She asked if we wanted to know. James and I looked at each other and nodded. Leanna told us, and James started crying immediately, tears running down his face while he stared at the screen. I squeezed his hand and felt my own eyes getting wet. We decided right there not to tell anyone else yet. This was ours to hold privately for a while. Leanna printed extra ultrasound photos, and James tucked them carefully into his wallet. When we got home, he put one on the refrigerator with a magnet. He stood there looking at it for a long time. Then he said he was overwhelmed by becoming a father while still processing his own complicated parental relationships. I wrapped my arms around him from behind, and we stood there together looking at the grainy black and white image of our baby. A reminder of what we were building together despite everything trying to tear us apart. Viola called on a Tuesday evening and asked if we wanted to come to a support group meeting she'd found. She said it was for family members dealing with people who had narcissistic personality disorder. James hesitated when I told him about it, his hand freezing on the remote control. He asked if we really needed that, if therapy wasn't enough already. I reminded him that his therapist had mentioned support groups might help. He stared at the TV for a long minute before nodding and saying he'd try it once. The meeting was Thursday night in a church basement with folding chairs arranged in a circle. 8 people sat around drinking coffee from styrofoam cups. Viola waved us over and introduced us to the group leader, a woman in her 50s who explained how the meetings worked. Everyone shared their stories if they wanted to. No one had to talk if they weren't ready. James sat rigid in his chair, his knee bouncing up and down. A man across the circle talked about his mother calling his workplace to spread lies about him. A woman described how her sister stole her identity and maxed out credit cards in her name. Another person shared about being blamed for everything that went wrong in their parents' life. James's knee stopped bouncing. He leaned forward slightly, listening harder. When it was his turn to share, he said his name and that his mother had just been convicted of multiple crimes, including identity theft against his wife. His voice cracked, saying it out loud to strangers. The group nodded with understanding, not judgment. After the meeting ended, 3 people came up to talk to James privately. They shared their own stories of mothers who manipulated and controlled. One man said it took him 5 years to stop feeling guilty for setting boundaries. James drove us home in silence, his hands tight on the steering wheel. When we got to our apartment, he collapsed on the couch and said he felt exhausted, like he'd run a marathon. I sat next to him and he put his head on my shoulder. He said it helped knowing other people understood the confusion and guilt, that he wasn't crazy for feeling torn between anger and sadness, that other people had survived this and built normal lives afterward. Rosamond called the next week with news about Brianna's trial date. It was set for 3 months away, which she said was actually fast given how backed up the court system was. I did the math in my head while she talked. 3 months meant I'd be 28 weeks pregnant when I testified. Very pregnant. Visibly, obviously pregnant, standing in front of a jury talking about my mother-in-law's crimes. I thanked Rosamond and hung up, then immediately called Leanna's office to ask about the physical demands of testifying while that pregnant. The nurse said she'd have Leanna call me back. Leanna called during her lunch break and asked how long I'd potentially be on the stand. I told her probably a full day, maybe 2 days depending on cross-examination. She went quiet for a moment before saying, that was a lot of sitting and stress at that stage of pregnancy. She asked about my blood pressure, which had been slightly elevated at my last appointment. I admitted the stress wasn't helping. She said she'd write a letter to the court if needed, but trials rarely got postponed for witnesses. That evening, James and I talked about whether to ask Rosamond if the trial could be delayed. He pointed out that Brianna would stay in jail longer if we delayed, which felt like its own kind of justice. But I worried about my health and the baby's health. We called Rosamond and asked about the possibility of postponement. She sighed and said the court schedule was packed for months. Any delay would likely push the trial into next year, which meant Brianna's lawyer would file motion after motion trying to get evidence thrown out. It meant more months of legal limbo and stress. She said the choice was ours, but recommended moving forward as scheduled. James looked at me and I looked at my small bump, and we both knew we didn't want this dragging into next year. I told Rosamond we'd stick with the current trial date. She said she'd make sure I had breaks during testimony and could sit instead of stand, that she'd work with the judge to minimize the physical strain. After we hung up, James put his hand on my stomach and said he was sorry I had to go through this while pregnant. I told him it wasn't his fault, but we both knew that didn't make it easier. Robert called James on Saturday morning asking for help with something. He said he'd sold the house and bought a condo closer to our apartment. He wanted James to come see it and help set up a room. James agreed, and we drove over that afternoon. The condo was smaller than the house, but brighter, with big windows and clean white walls. Robert had barely unpacked, boxes stacked everywhere. He led us to a second bedroom and said he wanted to make it a nursery for when the baby visited. James stopped in the doorway, his eyes getting wet. Robert had already bought a crib still in its box and several cans of paint in soft colors. He asked what color we thought would work best. I suggested a light green that would work for any baby. Robert nodded and opened the paint cans while James stood there trying not to cry. We spent the afternoon painting, covering the walls in smooth green strokes. Robert told stories about painting James's nursery 30 years ago, how Brianna had insisted on a specific shade of blue and made him repaint it 3 times, how she'd controlled every detail of their lives even then. James asked if Robert had noticed the control back then, or if it seemed normal. Robert said it seemed normal at the time because it was all he knew, that looking back now he could see the patterns clearly. We finished the first coat and started assembling the crib, following instructions that made no sense. Robert and James argued good-naturedly about which piece went where. They laughed when they had to take apart a section they'd put together wrong. By evening, the room looked almost finished, just needing a second coat of paint. Robert ordered pizza, and we ate sitting on his living room floor surrounded by boxes. He asked about baby names and nursery plans for our apartment. James talked about the furniture we'd picked out and the mobile Elizabeth had bought us. Robert listened and smiled, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him since the wedding. When we left, Robert hugged James and said he was glad they were building new memories in a space Brianna had never touched. James cried in the car on the way home, but this time they were good tears. The letter from Portland Cryobank arrived on a Wednesday. James brought in the mail and froze when he saw the return address. He sat at the kitchen table and stared at the envelope for 10 minutes before opening it. I made tea and sat across from him, waiting. He finally tore it open and pulled out a single page. His eyes scanned the text, and his face went blank. The letter contained limited information about donor number 447, a medical student in 1997, 24 years old at the time of donation, 6 feet tall, brown hair, blue eyes, blood type O positive, no major health conditions. Requested reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. That was it. James read the page 3 times, his finger tracing the lines. He said it felt wrong, reducing his biological father to a list of physical traits and medical facts, like ordering from a catalog instead of learning about a real person. I asked if it helped at all to have the information. He said he didn't know yet. He took the letter to the living room and sat on the couch staring at it. I left him alone, knowing he needed space to process. An hour later, I found him still sitting there, the letter on his lap. He said he kept trying to picture this person, this medical student who needed money, whether he looked like James, whether they had similar interests or personalities, whether the man ever thought about the children he'd helped create. I sat next to him and he leaned against me. He said the clinical description made it harder somehow, not easier, that he'd hoped for something more personal, some detail that would make his biological father feel real. Instead, he had height and hair color and nothing else. He folded the letter carefully and put it in his desk drawer. Said he needed time before deciding what to do with the information, whether to try finding the man or just let it be a list of facts in a drawer. I told him there was no rush, that he could take all the time he needed to figure out what he wanted. Helen's trial ended when I was 18 weeks pregnant. My bump now impossible to hide under regular clothes. James got a notification that the sentencing hearing was happening that afternoon. We debated whether to watch the video stream, but ultimately decided we needed to see it. Helen accepted a plea deal that included 2 years in prison and payments to reimburse me for the identity theft damages. The judge asked if she wanted to make a statement before sentencing. Helen stood up, her hands shaking, and said she was sorry. That she'd let Brianna manipulate her into crimes she knew were wrong. That she'd been weak and greedy and had hurt innocent people. She looked directly at the camera and apologized specifically to me and James for her role in everything. Said she understood if we never forgave her, but wanted us to know she regretted her choices. The judge sentenced her and court adjourned. James closed the laptop and sat back in his chair. I asked how he felt, and he said he didn't know. That he expected to feel angry or sad or something, but instead he felt nothing. Just empty. That worried him more than if he'd had a strong reaction. His therapist later told him that numbness was normal after months of emotional overload, that his brain was protecting itself from more pain. But James said it felt wrong to watch his aunt go to prison and feel nothing at all. Like Brianna had broken something inside him that used to work. I reminded him that healing wasn't linear, that feelings would come back when he was ready. He nodded but didn't look convinced. Elizabeth organized a baby shower for me when I was 19 weeks along, keeping it small and private. Just 6 close friends who'd supported us through everything. She decorated her apartment with simple streamers and balloons, nothing over the top. We played silly games, guessing baby food flavors and measuring my belly with toilet paper. Everyone laughed when someone guessed I was twice as big as I actually was. We ate cake and opened gifts, tiny clothes and soft blankets and practical things like bottles and diapers. For 3 hours, I got to feel like a normal pregnant woman excited about her baby. Not someone preparing to testify against her criminal mother-in-law. Not someone whose wedding had ended in multiple arrests. Just a woman having her first baby, surrounded by friends who cared. Elizabeth had invited James to join for the last hour. He showed up with flowers and helped open gifts, his eyes getting wet when he pulled out a tiny pair of shoes. He held them in his palm and said he couldn't believe something so small would fit a real person soon. That our baby would wear these and take first steps in them. Elizabeth's girlfriend took photos of us holding up baby clothes, laughing at the tiny sizes. James opened a gift bag and found a onesie that said, "Worth the wait," and he started crying for real. He said he couldn't believe something good was coming from this nightmare year. That after everything with Brianna and the arrests and the trial, we were still getting this perfect thing. Our baby, our family. I hugged him and told him we'd survived the worst part. That everything from here would be better. The other guests wiped their eyes and someone suggested more cake. We spent the rest of the evening eating and talking about baby names and nursery colors. Normal conversations about normal things. When everyone left, James and I packed up the gifts and drove home. He carried everything upstairs and arranged it carefully in the nursery. Stood there looking at the tiny clothes and said he felt hopeful for the first time in months. Rosamond called with frustrating news about Brianna's defense team. They'd filed a motion to exclude certain evidence, specifically the recordings I'd made of Brianna's phone calls. They argued that my decision to arrange her arrest at the wedding showed I'd planned everything deliberately. That I'd orchestrated the public humiliation out of spite. That this premeditation undermined my victim status and made me look vindictive rather than scared. Rosamond said it was a desperate tactic, and the judge would likely deny the motion. But hearing my actions described as calculated and vengeful in legal documents made my stomach hurt. I'd exposed Brianna because her crimes needed consequences, not because I enjoyed destroying her. but the defense lawyer had twisted it into something ugly. James read the motion and got angry, saying they were trying to make me the villain when I was the victim. Rosamond agreed but said this was standard defense strategy. Make the victim look bad so the jury sympathizes with the defendant. She assured us the evidence was solid and the motion would fail. But I spent the next 2 days questioning my choices again. Had I been vindictive choosing the wedding for the arrest? Could I have handled it differently? My therapist reminded me that Brianna had committed actual crimes, that exposing her wasn't wrong even if the timing was dramatic, that I'd protected myself and others from further harm. Logically, I knew that was true. But emotionally, I felt sick seeing my actions painted as cruel and calculated. James held me while I cried and said Brianna's lawyer was doing their job, trying any angle to defend their client, that it didn't make their arguments true. The judge denied the motion 3 days later. Rosamond called to tell us and said the trial would proceed as planned with all evidence included. I felt relieved but also exhausted from the emotional roller coaster. James said every step forward with this case came with 2 steps of stress and doubt, that he'd be glad when it was finally over. James got a message through the donor sibling registry that changed everything. Someone named Sue Napier had contacted him saying she was also a child of donor 447. She was 26, 2 years younger than James, and had been searching for genetic siblings for years. She'd found 3 others already, and wanted to connect with James if he was interested. James stared at the message on his laptop for a full minute without moving. I read it over his shoulder and felt my own shock at the idea of James having siblings he'd never known existed. Half-siblings connected by biology but nothing else. James closed the laptop and said he needed time to think. He spent 2 days processing the information, talking it through with his therapist and with me. He said part of him was curious to meet Sue and learn about their shared genetics. But another part felt overwhelmed by the idea of more family complications when he was still dealing with Brianna and Robert. On the 3rd day, he opened the laptop and typed a response. Said he'd be interested in meeting if she wanted that he was new to all of this and still figuring out what it meant. Sue responded within an hour, excited and warm. She suggested meeting for coffee the following week. James agreed, and then spent the next several days anxious about what to say to a sister he'd never met. I reminded him that Sue was probably nervous too, that they were both navigating strange territory. The night before the meeting, James barely slept, staring at the ceiling wondering what Sue would be like, whether they'd have anything in common beyond genetics, whether meeting her would make him feel more connected or more lost. At 20 weeks pregnant, we went for the anatomy scan that would check the baby's development in detail. Leanna squeezed cold gel on my now obvious bump and moved the ultrasound wand around. The baby appeared on screen, so much bigger than last time. Leanna pointed out tiny fingers and toes, each one visible and perfect. She showed us the 4 chambers of the heart, all working exactly right. The curve of the spine, the shape of the skull, the kidneys and stomach, everything developing perfectly. James held my hand and watched the screen with wet eyes. Leanna asked if we wanted photos and printed out 6 different images. James took them carefully like they were made of glass. On the drive home, he kept looking at the photos on his lap. When we got to our apartment, he put one on the refrigerator with a magnet, stood there staring at it. Then he said quietly that he was scared of messing this up, of passing on his family's problems to our baby, of being a bad father because he didn't know how to be a good one. I wrapped my arms around him from behind and told him that being afraid of repeating patterns meant he was already breaking them. That awareness was the first step, that he'd spent months in therapy working through Brianna's manipulation specifically so he wouldn't repeat it. He turned around and hugged me tight, his hand on my bump. Said he wanted to be the kind of father Robert had been to him, present and loving and honest. Not perfect, but trying. I told him that was exactly the kind of father our baby needed. We stood there holding each other in front of the refrigerator, looking at the ultrasound photo of our tiny perfect baby who would be here in 4 months. Robert and James had their first real fight since the paternity revelation on a Sunday afternoon. They were at Robert's condo finishing the nursery when James mentioned he'd been contacted by a half-sister through the donor registry. Robert went quiet and asked if James planned to meet her. James said yes. He wanted to understand his genetic background. Robert asked if James was planning to find donor 447 too. James said maybe eventually, if the man was willing. Robert's face changed, anger flashing across it. He asked if James was trying to replace him. James said no, that wasn't what this was about. Robert said it felt like replacement, that James was looking for a real father to replace the fake one. James got angry then too, saying Robert had no right to be upset when he'd never questioned Brianna's lies. That Robert had let Brianna deceive him for 30 years without ever pushing back. Robert said that wasn't fair, that Brianna had been a master manipulator. James said Robert should have protected him better, should have seen through her lies sooner. They yelled at each other in the half-finished nursery, both saying things they didn't mean. Finally, Robert sat down hard on the floor and said he was scared, that he'd spent 30 years being James's father, and now he was terrified of losing that. James sat down next to him and said he was scared too. That meeting Sue didn't mean Robert mattered less. That biology and choice were different things, and choice mattered more. Robert wiped his eyes and said he knew that logically, but emotions weren't logical. James admitted he was angry that Robert had been so passive with Brianna for so long, that if Robert had stood up to her sooner, maybe things would have been different. Robert said he was sorry, that he'd failed James by not seeing Brianna clearly. They sat on the floor of the nursery surrounded by paint cans and baby furniture. Both apologized for the things they'd said in anger. Robert said he'd support James finding his biological father if that's what James needed. James said he needed time to figure out what he wanted, but that Robert would always be his dad regardless. They hugged awkwardly on the floor, then stood up and finished assembling the changing table, working side by side in comfortable silence, building something good together despite the complicated feelings underneath. A week after we finished the nursery, James told me Sue had reached out again. She wanted to meet for coffee. He looked at me like he needed permission, so I told him to go. He left the apartment fidgety and came back 3 hours later looking lighter than I'd seen him in months. Sue was a graphic designer, he said. Funny and easy to talk to. They'd discovered they both drummed their fingers in the same pattern when thinking. Both ordered coffee with too much sugar. Both had this habit of tilting their heads the same way when listening. James sat on our couch describing these tiny similarities like they were miracles. He said it felt weird to have instant connection with a stranger, while every conversation with Robert required so much work. I understood what he meant, but it made me sad for Robert. Biology gave James and Sue common ground without effort. Choice meant Robert had to fight for every inch of their relationship now. Brianna's trial started on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks later. I was 22 weeks pregnant, my belly obvious enough that strangers asked when I was due. James and I arrived at the courthouse early to avoid the cameras, but media vans already lined the street. Detective Jason met us at a side entrance and walked us through security. The courtroom filled up fast. Family members sat scattered through the rows, some glaring at us, others nodding support. Robert sat in the back by himself looking tired. Elizabeth saved us seats in the third row. Brianna entered in an orange jumpsuit, her hair pulled back severe, no makeup. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her eyes found my stomach immediately and stayed there for a long moment. I couldn't read her expression. Anger, maybe. Or regret. Or something else entirely. Rosamond Dean stood to give her opening statement. She walked the jury through 2 years of identity theft. Credit cards opened in my name. Loans I never applied for. Tax returns filed with my information. She described Brianna's embezzlement from Robert's company. The blackmail of Viola and others. The attempt to sabotage our wedding. The hiring of someone to seduce me. Rosamond's voice stayed calm and factual, but every detail sounded worse laid out in order like that. She painted Brianna as someone who manipulated and controlled everyone around her for years. A calculated criminal, not a protective mother. Brianna's lawyer objected twice, but the judge overruled both times. I watched the jury's faces. Some looked shocked, others disgusted. One woman in the front row kept shaking her head. When Rosamond finished, Brianna's lawyer stood for his opening. He talked about a devoted mother who made mistakes trying to protect her son from a manipulative woman. He said Brianna's actions came from love, not greed. That she was scared of losing James. The jury looked less convinced by his version. I testified on day 2. Walking to the witness stand made my legs shake. The bailiff swore me in, and I sat down trying to look calm. Rosamond asked me to describe discovering the identity theft. I walked through Detective Jason's first call. The shock of learning Brianna had been using my information for 2 years. I explained seeing the credit card statements, the loan applications, all with my name and social security number. Rosamond asked why I waited 3 weeks to have Brianna arrested. I said I wanted to coordinate with the detective to make sure the case was solid. That I didn't plan to do it at the wedding until I saw Brianna walk down the aisle in white. My voice stayed steady through most of it. Then Brianna's defense lawyer stood for cross-examination. He asked if I resented Brianna for opposing my relationship with James. I said no. He asked if I wanted revenge for her attempts to break us up. I said I wanted justice for crimes she committed. He suggested I orchestrated the public arrest out of spite. That I enjoyed humiliating Brianna in front of everyone she knew. I told him I made a choice to protect myself and hold her accountable. He kept pushing, implying I was vindictive and calculating. Rosamond objected several times. My hands shook holding the water glass, but I kept my answers short and factual. When I finally stepped down, James squeezed my hand so hard my fingers went numb. James testified on day 4. I sat in the gallery watching him walk to the stand, his face pale but determined. Rosamond asked him to describe his childhood with Brianna. James talked about her controlling behavior, how she manipulated situations to get her way. He described her calling the venue to cancel our wedding, changing the catering to foods I was allergic to, sending wrong dates to half our guests. His voice stayed even, but his eyes looked wet. Then he talked about finding out she'd hired someone to seduce me, about her breaking into our apartment and finding my pregnancy test, about her revealing his paternity in front of everyone at the wedding. Brianna interrupted twice from the defense table, shouting that she did everything for him. The judge threatened to remove her if she spoke again. James kept going, his testimony quiet but devastating. When Brianna's lawyer cross-examined, he tried to suggest James was turning against his mother to please me. James said no. He was holding her accountable because what she did was wrong. That love didn't excuse fraud and manipulation. I watched Brianna's face crumple, but she stayed silent this time. Robert testified the next day. He walked through years of financial fraud Brianna had committed against his company. Embezzled funds, falsified records, money transferred to accounts he didn't know existed. Then he described finding the cryobank receipts, the donor records, the falsified fertility treatment paperwork. 30 years of lies about James's paternity laid out in clinical detail. His voice never wavered, but I saw his hands grip the edge of the witness box. Brianna's lawyer tried to paint him as a bitter ex-husband exaggerating her crimes. But Robert had brought documentation, bank statements, medical records, donor registry confirmations, every claim backed by paper proof. The jury looked at the evidence folders stacked on the prosecutor's table. Robert's calm delivery made everything more believable. When he finished, Brianna stared at him with pure hatred. Viola testified about 5 years of blackmail. She described Brianna finding photos from when she worked as a stripper to pay for college. Brianna's threats to send them to Viola's husband's boss. The monthly payments Viola made to keep her quiet. Viola cried on the stand talking about living in constant fear. 3 more family members testified after her with similar stories. An uncle Brianna blackmailed over a DUI. A cousin she manipulated into helping her commit tax fraud. An aunt who paid Brianna for years to keep quiet about an affair. Each testimony showed the same pattern. Brianna finding people's secrets and using them for money or control. The jury's expressions shifted from skeptical to horrified as more witnesses described her manipulation. The defense rested after 2 days. They called character witnesses who described Brianna as a devoted mother and active community volunteer. A woman from her book club. A neighbor who said Brianna always helped with charity drives. People who knew her surface level and saw only what she wanted them to see. Brianna didn't testify. Her lawyer must have decided putting her on the stand would hurt more than help. The prosecution's rebuttal brought financial experts who explained the scope of fraud. A forensic accountant walked through every stolen dollar, every fake document, every fraudulent transaction. Then a psychologist testified about narcissistic personality disorder and patterns of manipulation. She never mentioned Brianna by name, but described behaviors that matched everything we'd heard. The jury took notes through all of it. Closing arguments happened on a Friday. Brianna's lawyer made one final appeal to sympathy. He talked about a mother who loved her son too much, who made mistakes trying to protect him, who acted out of fear of losing her only child. He suggested Brianna's crimes were exaggerated, that some family members had their own reasons to lie, that I had manipulated the situation to destroy her. The jury looked unmoved. Then Rosamond stood for the prosecution's closing. She systematically went through every crime. Identity theft backed by credit reports and bank statements. Embezzlement proven by financial records. Blackmail confirmed by multiple witnesses and payment records. Tax fraud documented by the IRS. She pointed out that love doesn't explain stealing someone's identity for 2 years. That protection doesn't require hiring someone to seduce your son's fiancé. That fear doesn't justify blackmailing family members. Her voice stayed calm, but every word landed hard. The jury went out to deliberate at 2 in the afternoon. We waited in a conference room the prosecutor's office let us use. James paced. Robert sat staring at nothing. Elizabeth brought coffee, nobody drank. 6 hours later, the bailiff called us back. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom felt smaller when we filed back in. Brianna was already seated at the defense table, her face blank. The jury foreman stood when the judge asked if they'd reached a verdict. Guilty on count 1, identity theft. Guilty on count 2, wire fraud. Guilty on count 3, tax evasion. Guilty on count 4, embezzlement. Guilty on every single count. The courtroom erupted. Some family members cheered. Others burst into tears. Brianna sat frozen, her face white. James gripped my hand so tight I felt my bones shift. I looked back and saw Robert in the last row with tears running down his face. The judge banged her gavel, calling for order. She scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. Brianna's lawyer requested bail pending sentencing. The judge denied it. As they led Brianna out in handcuffs, she looked at James one more time. He looked away. We left through a side exit to avoid reporters. James made it to the parking garage before throwing up next to a concrete pillar. I rubbed his back while he heaved, my own stomach churning. I was 23 weeks pregnant, exhausted. My lower back screaming from 2 weeks of hard courtroom benches. Elizabeth pulled her car around and drove us home. None of us spoke during the ride. James stared out the window. I held his hand. Robert had driven separately, but texted asking if we were okay. James didn't respond. We got home, kicked off our shoes, and collapsed into bed fully clothed. Elizabeth let herself out quietly. We slept for 14 hours straight, too drained to process anything. When I woke up, James was already awake staring at the ceiling. Neither of us said anything for a long time. 2 weeks crawled by after the guilty verdict. James and I moved through our apartment like ghosts, avoiding news coverage and unplugging the phone when reporters kept calling. My pregnancy belly grew more obvious, pushing against my shirts, a constant reminder of why we had to keep moving forward. I drafted my victim impact statement on our laptop, deleting and rewriting sentences dozens of times, trying to find words that captured what Brianna had stolen from me. James read over my shoulder sometimes but never offered suggestions, just squeezed my shoulder and walked away. The morning of sentencing arrived cold and gray, matching my mood. I put on the same black dress I'd worn to the trial, now tighter across my stomach. James wore his suit and kept checking his reflection in the mirror, straightening his tie over and over. Robert met us outside the courthouse, looking older than he had 2 weeks ago, new lines carved around his eyes. We walked through security together, none of us speaking, and found seats in the packed courtroom. Brianna was already at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit, her hair pulled back without makeup, looking nothing like the woman who'd worn a wedding dress to destroy my ceremony. The judge called the hearing to order and asked if anyone wanted to make victim impact statements. I stood up, my legs shaking, and walked to the front. My prepared statement was 3 pages, printed in large font so I could read it even if my hands trembled. I started reading, my voice coming out smaller than I expected, talking about discovering the credit cards opened in my name, the loans I never took out, the tax returns filed with my information. I described the violation of having my identity stolen, my privacy invaded, the constant fear that my financial life was ruined before I even turned 30. My voice shook worse when I talked about the pregnancy, about the stress affecting my baby, about Brianna breaking into our apartment and finding my positive test. I looked up from the paper and stared directly at Brianna, wanting her to see my face, to understand the real damage she'd caused. She stared back with blank eyes, no emotion visible, like I was describing someone else's crimes. I finished reading and walked back to my seat, James gripping my hand so tight my fingers went numb. The judge asked if anyone else wanted to speak, and James stood up without letting go of my hand. He had to pull his fingers free from mine to walk to the front, and I saw him wiping his palms on his pants before picking up his own statement. He started reading about growing up with a mother who manipulated everyone, who controlled every situation, who made him doubt his own perceptions of reality. His voice cracked when he talked about learning his paternity was a lie, about discovering that his entire identity was built on deception. He had to stop twice to breathe, tears running down his face, and I saw several people in the jury box wiping their own eyes. James talked about choosing to break the cycle for his own child, about refusing to pass on the patterns of manipulation and control. Brianna suddenly stood up, her chair scraping loud against the floor, and started shouting that she did everything for him, that she was protecting him, that I was the real villain. The judge banged her gavel and ordered Brianna removed from the courtroom. 2 bailiffs had to physically drag her out while she screamed James's name over and over. The courtroom went silent after the doors closed behind her, everyone staring at the empty defense table. James finished his statement in a quieter voice, talking about how he was choosing love over fear, honesty over control, building a family based on trust instead of lies. He walked back to his seat and collapsed next to me, his whole body shaking. The judge took a 10-minute recess and we sat in the hallway outside while the lawyers conferred. Robert bought us water from a vending machine and we drank it without talking, too drained for words. When we filed back in, Brianna was seated again at the defense table, her lawyer's hand on her arm like a warning. The judge read the sentence in a calm, measured voice. 8 years in prison with possibility of parole after 5. Restitution payments to all victims for financial damages. Mandatory psychological counseling throughout her sentence and after release. The sentence was significant, but not the maximum, and I felt a weird mix of relief and disappointment sitting in my chest. Part of me wanted her locked away forever, and part of me just wanted this whole nightmare to end. James leaned close and whispered that no sentence would feel adequate because what she stole couldn't be measured in years or dollars. He was right, but hearing the judge say 8 years still felt like something solid, a boundary drawn around Brianna's ability to hurt us anymore. Robert took us to dinner at a quiet restaurant across town, away from the courthouse and the reporters who'd tried to follow us. We sat in a back booth and ordered food none of us really wanted, pushing pasta around our plates. Robert raised his water glass and said we should toast to moving forward despite the scars Brianna left on all of us. James and I lifted our glasses and clinked them together, the sound small and fragile. Robert cleared his throat and announced he was dating someone, a woman named Claire he'd met at a support group for divorce recovery. He said she was kind and patient, and she knew his whole complicated story about Brianna's deception and the paternity revelation. James asked questions about Claire, genuinely interested, and I watched Robert's face light up talking about her. He looked younger when he smiled, less burdened. and I realized we were all slowly learning that Brianna's damage didn't have to define what came next. We could build new things from the wreckage, make different choices, create families based on what we chose instead of what we were born into. The dinner felt almost normal. 3 people sharing a meal and making plans, and I held on to that feeling like a life raft. At 26 weeks pregnant, I finally felt ready to focus on preparing for the baby instead of legal proceedings. James and I spent a Saturday morning at a furniture store, picking out a crib and a changing table and a rocking chair for the nursery. We argued about paint colors, me wanting soft yellow and James insisting on light green, until we compromised on a pale cream that looked good with both our choices. Robert had bought us the crib as a gift, a beautiful wooden one that cost more than our monthly rent, and James spent Sunday afternoon assembling it while I painted the walls. We bickered about furniture placement, whether the changing table should go near the window or near the door. Normal couple disagreements that felt refreshing after months of crisis mode. I stepped back to look at the finished nursery, cream walls and wooden furniture and soft light coming through the curtains, and felt the first real spark of excitement about becoming a mother. James came up behind me and put his hands on my belly, feeling the baby kick against his palms, and we stood there together imagining the life we were building. Sue reached out the next week, inviting us to meet 2 other donor siblings she'd connected with through the registry. James spent the whole drive to the coffee shop nervously tapping his fingers on the steering wheel, asking me what he should say, how he should act, whether meeting genetic half-siblings was weird or normal. I told him it was both and that was okay. The coffee shop was crowded and loud, and Sue waved us over to a corner table where 2 other people sat waiting. Daniel was 32, a teacher from Seattle with James's same blue eyes and sharp jawline. Keisha was 29, a nurse from Sacramento with the same quick smile and nervous hand gestures. They spent 3 hours talking, comparing photos of themselves as kids, laughing at shared mannerisms they'd never known came from donor genetics. James came home that night energized, talking nonstop about how Daniel had the same weird habit of cracking his knuckles before making decisions, how Keisha organized her thoughts the same way James did when he was stressed. He said it felt like finding pieces of himself scattered across the country and strangers who somehow felt like family, despite having no shared history. I listened and asked questions, watching him piece together a new understanding of where he came from, who he was built from, what parts of himself were choice and what parts were just biology. A week later, donor 447 reached out through the registry. James stared at the email for 20 minutes before opening it, his finger hovering over the mouse. The message was short and careful, introducing himself as Guillermo Salas, now a 51-year-old doctor in Portland. He said he'd donated sperm in medical school to pay for textbooks and rent, never expecting to hear from any biological children. He was willing to meet James if James wanted that, but he made it clear he didn't expect or want to replace Robert, that he understood his role was biological, not parental. James read the email out loud 3 times, his voice getting quieter each time. He spent the next 2 days agonizing over whether to respond, torn between curiosity about his genetic background and loyalty to Robert. He'd lie awake at night next to me, staring at the ceiling, asking questions I couldn't answer about what he owed to biology versus choice, whether meeting Guillermo was betraying Robert, whether knowing his biological father would help him be a better dad himself. Robert came over for dinner the following Saturday, and James finally brought up the email from Guillermo. Robert set down his fork and looked at James for a long moment before speaking. He said that meeting Guillermo didn't threaten their relationship, that he was secure enough now to understand James needed answers about his biological origins. They talked for over an hour about what fatherhood meant beyond genetics, about the daily choice to show up and love someone, about commitment that went deeper than DNA. Robert said he'd chosen to be James's father every single day for 30 years, and that choice made him James's real dad no matter what any blood test said. James cried and Robert cried, and they ended up hugging in our kitchen while I gave them privacy. James decided that night to arrange a meeting with Guillermo for after the baby was born, wanting to focus on his own impending fatherhood first, before dealing with his complicated biological one. At 28 weeks pregnant, we started childbirth classes at the hospital where I'd deliver. The classroom was full of other expectant couples, all of us awkward and nervous, sitting on yoga mats while an instructor demonstrated breathing techniques. James practiced the breathing with me, his hand on my lower back, learning how to support me during labor. Being surrounded by other pregnant women made our situation feel almost normal for the first time in months, like we were just another couple preparing for a baby instead of people recovering from a family implosion. The instructor asked everyone to share their support system, and James talked about Robert and Elizabeth and our friends who'd carried us through this nightmare year. His voice was full of genuine gratitude, and I realized we'd built something strong from the broken pieces, a chosen family that showed up when biology failed us. 2 days later, a letter arrived from Brianna. James held the envelope for a full minute before opening it, checking the return address twice like he didn't trust what he was seeing. The letter inside was 3 pages long, handwritten in Brianna's neat script. I read over his shoulder while he read it out loud. For the first time, it actually sounded like a real apology instead of manipulation. Brianna acknowledged what she'd done, took responsibility for her crimes without making excuses, and said she was in therapy working on understanding her behavior. She wrote about recognizing her need for control, her fear of losing James, her inability to see him as a separate person with his own life. James read it twice, his face skeptical, and I could see him trying to figure out if this was another manipulation or genuine growth. He called his therapist that afternoon and read the letter over the phone, asking if narcissists could actually change. The therapist said people could change and growth was possible even for narcissists who hit rock bottom, but that James should be cautious and take his time deciding how to respond. James folded the letter and put it in his desk drawer, saying he'd think about it after the baby was born, after he had space to process whether Brianna's words matched any future actions. The check arrived on a Tuesday morning, a plain white envelope with the state seal in the corner. James opened it at the kitchen table while I poured coffee, and we both stared at the number printed on the cashier's check. $63,000, the final payment from Brianna's seized assets, after the court processed everything and took their fees. It covered most of the identity theft damages, about half our legal bills, and represented 2 years of Brianna's crimes reduced to a dollar amount that felt both huge and completely inadequate. James turned the check over in his hands like he couldn't believe it was real, like Brianna might somehow reach out from prison and snatch it back. I sat down across from him, my belly pressing against the table edge at 29 weeks pregnant, and watched him process what this money meant. He folded the check carefully and slid it back into the envelope, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "We should put it toward the baby's college fund," he said quietly. "Take what Brianna stole and turn it into something good for her grandchild, someone she might never meet if we decide she doesn't get to be part of our daughter's life." I nodded, feeling the weight of that decision hanging over us, knowing we had years to figure out whether Brianna's prison therapy was genuine or just another manipulation. We deposited the check that afternoon, watching the bank teller process the transaction, and I felt one chapter of this nightmare finally close even though so many others remained open. At 30 weeks pregnant, I couldn't see my feet anymore, and getting out of bed required a strategic rolling maneuver that James found both adorable and concerning. He'd transformed into the most attentive, slightly annoying version of himself, researching every pregnancy symptom I mentioned and presenting solutions before I finished describing the problem. My back aches meant he bought 3 different pregnancy pillows and rearranged our bed nightly, trying to find the perfect configuration. My swollen ankles sent him down internet rabbit holes about circulation and elevation techniques. He baby-proofed our apartment twice, the second time catching hazards he'd missed in the first sweep, installing cabinet locks and outlet covers and corner guards on furniture. Our baby wouldn't be mobile enough to reach for at least a year. The hospital bag sat packed by the front door 6 weeks early, organized with color-coded labels and a printed checklist he consulted daily to make sure nothing was missing. Elizabeth came over one evening and found James measuring the distance between our bed and the bassinet, calculator in hand, explaining optimal positioning for nighttime feeding efficiency. She laughed until she had to sit down, then asked if he'd also calculated the precise angle for diaper changes. James blushed but admitted he'd thought about it, and Elizabeth told him he was going to be an anxious dad already, which wasn't necessarily bad, but maybe he could dial it back about 10%. He sat on the couch looking sheepish, and I squeezed his hand, telling him I appreciated the care even when it veered into obsessive territory. That night in bed, he put his hand on my belly and admitted he was terrified, that every pregnancy book he read listed 100 things that could go wrong, that becoming a father while still processing his own complicated parentage felt overwhelming. I turned to face him in the darkness, feeling our daughter kick against his palm, and said being scared meant he cared, that terror and excitement weren't opposites but 2 sides of the same overwhelming love. Robert called on a Sunday morning asking if he could stop by, and when he arrived he looked nervous in a way I'd never seen before. He sat in our living room making small talk about the weather in our apartment and anything except what he actually came to say, until James finally asked him directly what was going on. Robert took a breath and asked if he could be in the delivery room when the baby was born, if James thought that would be okay, if I would be comfortable with him there for such an intimate moment. James said yes immediately, his face lighting up, not even glancing at me for input or agreement. I felt a flash of annoyance that he'd made that decision without consulting me, that he'd invited someone into the delivery room like it was his choice alone when I'd be the one actually giving birth. Robert must have seen something in my expression because he quickly added that he understood if I preferred to keep it just me and James, that he didn't want to intrude on something so personal. I sat there feeling both emotions at once, irritated at James for his assumption, but also touched by how much he wanted Robert was included in this milestone, how he was actively choosing the father who'd raised him over the biological stranger who'd contributed genetics. After a long moment, I said that Robert could be there, that I actually wanted him there along with Elizabeth, that we'd create our support team from the people who'd chosen to love us through this nightmare year rather than the family we'd been born into. Robert's eyes got wet, and he thanked me quietly, and James reached over to squeeze both our hands, building his chosen family one decision at a time. James met Guillermo for coffee when I was 32 weeks pregnant. Too uncomfortable to join them, but curious about how it would go. He left the apartment nervous, checking his reflection 3 times and asking if he should have worn something different, like meeting his biological father required a specific outfit. I told him Guillermo had already seen his photo through the registry, that what he wore didn't matter. But I understood the anxiety of trying to make a good first impression on someone who was technically responsible for half your DNA. James came home 3 hours later looking thoughtful and slightly disappointed in a way he seemed reluctant to explain. Guillermo was kind, he told me, a pediatrician now with 2 kids of his own from his marriage, curious about James's life and medical history, and genuinely interested in answering questions. They shared some physical similarities, the same nose shape and hand gestures, small genetic echoes that felt both meaningful and completely insufficient. But there was no instant connection, no sense of recognition or belonging, no feeling that this stranger was secretly the father James had been missing his whole life. Guillermo asked intelligent questions and shared relevant information about genetic health history, but it felt more like a productive medical consultation than a father-son reunion. James sat on our couch looking at photos Guillermo had shared of his kids, James's genetic half-siblings, and said it was good to meet him and understand his biological background, good to have answers about where certain traits came from, and what health issues to watch for. But Robert was his father in every way that actually mattered, in the daily choices and constant presence and unconditional love that had nothing to do with biology. I curled up next to him, my belly pressed against his side, and told him that understanding that difference was exactly what would make him a good father to our daughter. Viola invited us to a family gathering at her house 2 weeks later, a dinner for everyone who'd supported us through Brianna's trial and chosen accountability over blind loyalty. James was nervous about seeing extended family after everything that had happened, worried about awkward conversations and people taking sides, but I convinced him we needed to start rebuilding connections with the relatives who'd stood by us. We arrived to find Viola's house full of people, maybe 15 family members who'd either testified against Brianna or publicly supported the prosecution, all of them navigating the same complicated feelings about turning against one of their own. Viola hugged us both at the door and thanked me again for having the courage to expose Brianna, saying my public confrontation had freed multiple people from years of manipulation and fear. We shared a meal around her dining table, passing dishes and telling stories that carefully avoided mentioning Brianna directly, everyone working hard to create normal family interaction from the broken pieces she'd left behind. James's uncle shared a funny story about James as a toddler, and his cousin reminisced about family vacations before Brianna's control became suffocating, and slowly the conversation relaxed into genuine warmth. I watched James laugh at a story about his childhood and realized we were building something here, a family structure based on choice and mutual support rather than obligation and fear. After dinner, Viola stood and proposed a toast to new beginnings and breaking cycles, to choosing honesty over loyalty to people who'd hurt us, to building the family we deserved rather than accepting the one we'd been given. Everyone raised their glasses and I felt tears on my face. 33 weeks pregnant and surrounded by people who'd chosen to love us through the absolute worst year of our lives. At 34 weeks, my blood pressure spiked during a routine appointment, and Leanna put me on modified bed rest immediately. The stress from the past months had caught up with my body, she explained, and continuing to push through could risk both my health and the baby's. James took family leave from work that same day, not even waiting to process paperwork properly, just telling his boss he was done until after the baby arrived. He transformed our bedroom into a comfortable nest, moving the TV in and setting up a little table for meals and organizing everything I might need within arm's reach. We spent long days watching movies and talking about baby names, testing out different options and imagining our daughter's personality based on nothing but hope and fear. James read parenting books obsessively, highlighting passages and taking notes, then asking me dozens of questions about what kind of parents we wanted to be. Did we believe in sleep training or co-sleeping, breast or bottle, structured schedules or baby-led routines, and how did we prevent repeating our family's mistakes while still maintaining our own identities? I told him we'd figure it out as we went, that no amount of research could fully prepare us for the reality of a newborn, but I appreciated his dedication to getting it right. He brought me meals in bed and helped me to the bathroom and rubbed my swollen feet while we debated whether our daughter would be artistic like him or practical like me. The forced rest was frustrating, but also gave us time to actually prepare emotionally for parenthood, to talk through our fears and hopes without the distraction of work and legal proceedings. Robert came over one afternoon carrying a cardboard box he'd saved from the house before selling it, James's childhood belongings he couldn't bear to throw away. They spent hours on our living room floor sorting through photos and report cards and art projects, James holding up each item and asking Robert to tell him the story behind it. Robert remembered everything, the context for every photo and the circumstances of every milestone. 30 years of active fathering contained in a box of mementos. James showed me pictures of himself as a baby, pointing out the nose that came from Guillermo and the eyes that matched neither Robert nor Brianna, genetic markers of his complicated origins. But the memories themselves belonged entirely to Robert, the man who'd chosen to be his father every single day regardless of biology. James found his baby book with Robert's handwriting documenting first words and first steps, careful notes about his personality and preferences, evidence of devoted attention that had nothing to do with shared DNA. He looked at Robert with tears in his eyes and said he was finally making peace with having two fathers in different ways, that biology and choice both mattered, but choice mattered more, that Guillermo gave him genetic information, but Robert gave him everything else. They hugged, surrounded by scattered childhood photos, and I watched from the couch with my hand on my belly, hoping our daughter would always feel this kind of chosen, committed love. Elizabeth threw us a second baby shower now that the legal nightmare was over, this one bigger and more celebratory than the small gathering we'd had months ago. She invited everyone who'd supported us, filling her apartment with friends and family bearing gifts and advice and genuine excitement for our daughter's arrival. James teared up during a game where people shared parenting wisdom, listening to Robert talk about James's first steps, and the pride of watching him grow into a good man. Sue showed up with a gift from all James's genetic half-siblings, a photo book they'd made together showing their families and lives, a record of the genetic family James hadn't known existed a year ago. She shared a funny story about her own childhood that made everyone laugh, and I realized we were building something completely new here, a family structure assembled from broken pieces that somehow fit together better than the original. People brought tiny clothes and practical supplies and books they'd loved reading to their own children, each gift representing someone's faith in our ability to be good parents despite the chaos we'd survived. I sat in Elizabeth's living room surrounded by wrapped packages and people who'd chosen to love us, 36 weeks pregnant and finally believing we might actually be ready for this. I went into labor at 38 weeks, 3 in the morning, my water breaking with enough force to soak through the sheets. James woke up panicking beautifully, running in 3 different directions before actually accomplishing anything useful, asking me questions I couldn't answer between contractions. He grabbed his phone and wallet but forgot the hospital bag sitting by the front door, loaded me into the car and drove 5 miles toward his office instead of the hospital, before I managed to gasp out that he was going the wrong direction. Elizabeth met us in the hospital parking lot, having anticipated James's panic and driven over with the forgotten hospital bag and calm reassurance that everything would be okay. Robert arrived 20 minutes later with coffee and snacks, and the steady presence of someone who'd been through this before, even if not biologically. The labor was long and difficult, contractions that felt like my body was trying to turn itself inside out, hours of pain and exhaustion, and James holding my hand while I squeezed hard enough to leave marks. But I was surrounded by people who'd chosen to love us through the worst year of our lives, Robert on one side, and Elizabeth on the other, and James right in front of me, and that made every contraction more bearable, knowing I wasn't alone in this. Our daughter arrived at 3:47 in the morning, healthy and screaming with impressive lung capacity, and James cut the cord with shaking hands while crying so hard he could barely see what he was doing. Robert took photos with tears streaming down his face, documenting the moment his chosen son became a father, and Elizabeth held my hand telling me I was amazing while I felt completely destroyed and more powerful than I'd ever been. The nurse placed our daughter on my chest, warm and wet and furious about being born, and James leaned in close, touching her tiny fingers with wonder in his eyes. We named her Liana Viola, after the doctor who'd supported me through the pregnancy, and the cousin who'd found courage to break free from Brianna's control, giving our daughter a name that honored the women who'd helped us survive. James held her carefully, terrified he'd do something wrong, and whispered promises about being the father she deserved, about breaking cycles and choosing love and never making her feel like she had to earn his affection. Robert stood behind him with his hand on James's shoulder, 3 generations of chosen family in one room, and I watched them through exhausted tears, knowing we'd built something good from the absolute wreckage of the worst wedding day in history. The next morning, I woke to find James already awake, standing beside the plastic hospital bassinet where Liana slept. He lifted her carefully, supporting her tiny head the way the nurses had shown him, and settled into the chair by the window. Morning light caught the tears on his face as he looked down at her, this perfect small person who'd just entered his complicated world. He started talking to her in a voice so quiet I almost couldn't hear, telling her about the grandmother she might never meet, the woman in prison who'd stolen and manipulated and destroyed so much. He explained about Robert, the grandfather who chose every single day to be his father, despite learning the truth about genetics and lies. He told her about Guillermo, the medical student who donated biology but nothing else, who gave James his height and eye color but not one memory or bedtime story or scraped knee bandaged with love. His voice broke when he promised her he'd be different, that he'd choose honesty even when it hurt, that he'd show love through actions, not just words, that she'd never have to guess whether she was wanted or valued or enough. I stayed still, pretending to sleep, letting him have this moment with his daughter. 3 days later, We brought Leanna home to an apartment that looked nothing like we'd left it. Elizabeth had organized everything while we were at the hospital, coordinating friends to fill our fridge with meals and our living room with flowers. Cards covered the kitchen counter from people who'd supported us through the absolute disaster of the past year. James carried Leanna inside like she might shatter, moving so carefully through the door, and placed her in the crib Robert had assembled and positioned by our bedroom window. Robert arrived that evening with more food and baby supplies we hadn't thought to buy. Practical things like extra burp cloths and diaper cream. He washed his hands twice before reaching for Leanna, his movements gentle and uncertain as he held his granddaughter for the first time outside the hospital chaos. The look on his face as he stared down at her, this tiny person who shared no DNA with him but everything that mattered, confirmed what we'd been learning all year. Family wasn't about biology or blood or genetic matches from cryobanks. It was built through choice and commitment, and showing up even when everything fell apart. Brianna's crimes had brought us to this moment, to this small apartment filled with people who'd chosen to love us through the worst. But those crimes didn't define what we were building. We were exhausted and scared and had no idea what we were doing with this helpless infant who needed everything from us. But we were also genuinely happy for the first time since the wedding disaster, holding something good we'd made from the wreckage. And that's how it ends. I love stories that make us stop for a second and think, if this one did that for you, I'd call it a success.